So I published a video where I was explaining or trying to speculate on what would have happened if Africa was never colonized. Now, in the video or under the video, I saw, of course, many comments, but there are a few that stood out for me. And these are the ones that seemed to suggest that if the Europeans never colonized Africa, then nothing would be happening. Those sentiments reminded me of a statement that I heard from a certain old man I used to like having conversations with. He was very old and he passed on a few years ago at the age of close to 100 years. And I liked having conversations with this old man because there's a way he used uh, to trigger my thinking into exploring ideas that otherwise I would not have thought about. And I remember one statement that he made that I didn't grasp the meaning of it immediately, but it stayed with me. And I got to have the meaning of it become clear to me almost 20 years later, a very long time. The statement he made is that, people today think that our ancestors were very ignorant and they knew nothing, and that is the white man who brought knowledge. And he said that is sad because that is not what it is. He said our ancestors were very intelligent and they understood a lot of things, and we don't give them enough credit for what they understood and the knowledge they possessed and the knowledge they passed along. But thinking about it a lot more, I came to realize that this is a narrative that was brought, or a narrative that was created and spread by the colonizers, and it's for a very good reason in quotes. The reason why they needed to create this narrative that the Africans or the indigenous people were not smart enough is because that then gave them the moral right to come to this land and grab it and exploit it. It was a way to cope with the guilt that would have otherwise been very apparent, that how do you go to other people's land and just grab it and use it the way you want. So to deal with that guilt, they had to come with this narrative and then plant it in the minds of the people over time. Remember that the colonizers were here for a little bit over 100 years. It was a very long time. You can think of the generations. There are people who were born and died old. They were born within the colonial period and they died within the colonial period, and they didn't die young necessarily. They died old. So it was a very long time, and that's a long time enough to create narratives and to have them grow into being truths. So whatever literature you read that was written by the colonialists, say in the 19th century, you realize the portrayal of the African is savages, which basically translates to these are people who had no rules, who had no organization, who had no morals, who had nothing. These are people who lived like wild animals, basically, if you take that word to what it's supposed to mean. But just a little bit of research will tell you that wasn't what it was really. These societies were not societies of savages. These were societies that were well organized. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that as I go further in this video. Now, but that narrative had to stick because it was a narrative that was meant to give credibility to the invasion of Africa by the Europeans. Now, the most unfortunate thing, though, is that this is a narrative you would have expected that others should have believed about us. But the saddest part about it is that we've come to believe it, or at least some of us have come to believe that before the Europeans came here, we were savages, that we didn't have rules, we didn't have organization, we had no knowledge, we had nothing. So that's the sad part. It is unfortunate that some people came and created this narrative, and we can understand if others receive this narrative and they believed it. But it's very hard to understand why we end up where we are, that a few of us, and maybe many of us, believe that actually if the European didn't come to Africa, or when the colonizer came to Africa, there was really nothing there. We were savages. What we don't realize by holding those beliefs is that we lost their wisdom, or the wisdom of our ancestors and the knowledge that they had accumulated for thousands of years. And then we attribute our ignorance about that knowledge, we attribute our ignorance of that knowledge, especially outside of whatever that we are taught by the European, or whatever knowledge the European brought, and we attribute that ignorance to the ancestors. But it's not really their making. It's just that at some point we were tricked, and we were tricked to drop the wisdoms of our ancestors and to drop the knowledge that they had passed from generation to generation. We dropped it and grabbed the knowledge that was brought by the colonialists. And I need to point something else. The knowledge that the colonialists brought, to a large extent, wasn't different from the knowledge that our ancestors had. The only difference is the colonizers brought it in written form, while our ancestors preferred or would share it through word of mouth and culture and customs. I'll give you an example, or I'll give you an example, and will prove that probably our ancestors understood more about the environment than you and me do today. How many birds species do you know by name? How many plant species do you know by name? If you are taken to the wild today, somewhere in the Rift Valley, for example, how many plants can you point out and tell someone that this is called this, and this is called this, and this grows like this, and this is this, or this bird behaves like this? Most of us today can't do that. But you'll be surprised, people born in the villages even today, they know those birds by name and by how they act, how they breed, and things like that. And that's very high level knowledge that in today's society, it takes someone to have PhDs to have that kind of knowledge to tell you there's this species of bird on this plant and that and that. But our ancestors didn't need to have PhDs for that. You learned as you grew about the environment, and that was the most important thing, and it's still the most important thing, is to learn about our environment and how we can adapt so that we are able to survive in often very harsh environment, because we've always lived in very harsh environments as humans. So we can blame mostly our grandfathers, and to extent our great-grandfathers. If you are my age, maybe in your late 30s, early 40s, we can blame our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers. These are the generations that dropped the ball. These are the generations that were tricked into abandoning what was the African culture and African way of life and African way of learning. And they thought that was not good enough, and they abandoned it, and then they embraced this other one. And I'm not saying whatever knowledge the European brought is bad knowledge. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it didn't have to come at the expense of the knowledge of the people who lived on this land. But that happened. Those are the generations that dropped the ball. Those are the generations that were so much brainwashed into thinking everything indigenous is bad. Food and songs and practices and cultural practices, beliefs. These are the generations that were made to believe that all that is evil, in fact, and they dropped it. And then we lost it because they dropped it. And now we are here in 2025. We know very little from the past, and all we know is what was brought. And now we come to the conclusion that there was nothing in the past. Now, to drive further, besides what I've brought up about knowing the species of the animals, bird and plants, another way to realize that the ancestors were very intelligent people, you just have to look at how society was organized, and we can tell that by looking at the remnants of what that society was, because a lot of things have changed. But we still have remnants of those. If you go into the villages today, into the interior of Kenya, you can still find people who still hold to some bits and parts of what used to be the African traditional organization. You can, for example, explore how young men were initiated into adulthood, into being men, and the psychology that was used to break them down and then build them to become warriors. That's high-level psychology. That's that did not come from very ignorant people, like people want to think. That came from very smart people, because that's high level psychology that only today people with PhDs can describe in detail and explain how it works. But our ancestors had those systems in place to do that, to manage the society. Think of putting rules on intermarriages, for example, that this clan and this clan don't have to marry or shouldn't marry and procreate. You think that's not high level knowledge? If they didn't have high level knowledge, people would just be marrying whichever way they want, but they put rules for a reason, and it's very, very scientific if you think about it, because they knew if people intermarry or interbreed, let's use that word, then the society was not going to survive very long. They understood that's what our ancestors, and you want today say, oh, they were so ignorant, they didn't know nothing. So every cultural practice you see today in many African communities, they might not make sense to you, but trust me, there's a very practical reason why they are in place. There's a very practical, very even scientific reason why it's in place, even when it is packaged in a way that seems mystic or seems like fables or whatever way it is portrayed. There is always, when you peel it, there is always at the core, there is a scientific explanation for it. There is a way that it serves that community to survive, or it served that community to survive in a very harsh environment in the past. So our ancestors understood how to make societies survive in a very harsh environment. And what is the use of any kind of knowledge even today? Any kind of knowledge even today is about surviving. So then they survived, and that means a lot. So don't buy the narrative that was meant to justify an occupation of your people. Don't buy that. Don't simplify it to be like, oh, they brought us knowledge and everything. They brought knowledge, yeah, mathematics, architecture, but we can also argue that we had our own architecture. Have you looked at some of the designs of grass-thatched houses, for example, in Rwanda, that they used to design in the old days for maybe the king, and how they look, and you'd be like, it took a lot of craftsmanship to build that. Yes, it's grass-thatched, it's built using wood and grass, but yeah, you look at it, you're like, that's beautiful. So yeah, the Europeans brought architecture, but there was architecture here, our own kind. They brought mathematics. We had our own, but they added more to that. They brought so many good things, but that doesn't mean that we didn't have anything. And in the same case for them, the Europeans didn't have everything. Knowledge spread from, and that's how it has been for thousands of years in the human existence, that knowledge is discovered in one corner, it spreads to the others. The gunpowder was discovered, or you can say invented or discovered in China, but it spread to Europe and gave Europe so much power. So it's been the case that throughout human existence, knowledge spreads, but that does not mean the people who receive new knowledge had nothing. It just means they are getting an addition to what they already know. And at some point, they also generate some new knowledge that also spreads to other societies. The ancient Egyptians were very much respected in the ancient world. Herodotus describes them as people who are considered to be the wisest of all humans. And the Greeks used to travel to Egypt to learn. Pythagoras, the guy we know with the Pythagoras theorem, studied in Egypt. And the Greeks picked knowledge from Egypt. So knowledge that has been the case. So you can't claim that one category of people have the monopoly of knowledge. Not really. That if you look in the short term, it might seem so, but if you look at a large span of time, thousands of years, then you realize no, knowledge can come up at any point in the human distribution, and then it spreads. That has always been the case, and it will continue being the case as long as humans exist on Earth. So those are my random thoughts.